In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where loyalty is measured in blood and betrayal can come from the very people sworn to protect you, Captain Marcus Rodriguez learned that sometimes the greatest enemy isn't the one shooting at you from across the valley, it's the one standing right behind you, wearing the same uniform. What happens when a decorated war hero discovers that his most trusted ally has been feeding intelligence to the enemy? What price must be paid when honor collides with survival? And when does a soldier's duty to his country become secondary to his duty to the truth? This is the story of a man who fell from grace at 30,000 feet, only to rise from the ashes of betrayal to become something more powerful than he ever imagined. In a world where the line between friend and foe blurs like mirages in the desert heat, Marcus Rodriguez will discover that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out who you really are. Captain Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his helmet one final time as the C-130 Hercules transport plane cut through the morning sky over Afghanistan. The rumble of the engines provided a steady backdrop to his racing thoughts. At 28 years old, he had already earned a reputation as one of the most reliable officers in the 82nd Airborne Division. His men trusted him, his superiors respected him, and his record was spotless. Today's mission should have been routine: a reconnaissance drop behind enemy lines to gather intelligence on Taliban movements in the Kunar province. Sitting across from him in the cramped aircraft, Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. Patterson had been Marcus's mentor since he joined the division 4 years ago. The older man's weathered face bore the scars of 2 decades of military service, and his eyes held the kind of wisdom that only came from surviving multiple tours in hostile territory. Marcus had always looked up to him, seeing Patterson as the father figure he'd lost when his own dad died in a car accident during his senior year of high school. The red light above the cargo door began to flash, signaling they were approaching the drop zone. Marcus stood and moved down the line of 12 soldiers under his command, checking their equipment one final time. These men had been through hell with him in the past 18 months. Sergeant Mike Shen had saved his life during a firefight in Helmand province. Corporal David Williams had carried a wounded comrade 3 miles through enemy territory. Private First Class Tony Martinez had single-handedly held off a Taliban assault while the rest of the squad evacuated civilians from a burning village. "Remember, gentlemen," Marcus called out over the engine noise, "we're going in dark and staying quiet. Intelligence suggests minimal enemy presence in the area, but we all know how reliable that can be. Stay sharp, watch each other's backs, and we'll all be home for dinner." The men responded with nods and thumbs up. These weren't green recruits, they were battle-tested warriors who had earned their stripes through blood, sweat, and determination. Marcus felt a surge of pride as he looked at their faces. Despite the fear that naturally accompanied any combat mission, their expressions showed confidence and resolve. Patterson approached him as the green light flashed and the cargo door began to open. The rush of cold mountain air filled the aircraft, carrying with it the scent of pine trees and snow from the peaks below. "Marcus," Patterson said, placing a hand on his shoulder, "I've got some additional intel that just came through. There might be a high-value target in the area, possibly a Taliban commander we've been tracking for months. If you spot anything unusual, radio it in immediately." Marcus nodded, though something in Patterson's tone struck him as odd. In all their missions together, Patterson had never withheld information until the last minute. But there wasn't time to question it now. The jumpmaster was already signaling for the first group to move toward the door. One by one, the soldiers disappeared into the gray morning sky. Marcus watched them deploy their parachutes and adjust their descent toward the rocky terrain below. When his turn came, he took a deep breath and stepped into the void. The sensation of free fall always reminded him why he joined the airborne forces. There was something pure about that moment when gravity took control and everything else fell away. His parachute deployed smoothly, and he guided himself toward the designated landing zone, a small clearing surrounded by dense forest about 15 miles from the nearest village. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, their snow-capped peaks gleaming in the early sunlight. It was beautiful and deadly, like everything else in this war-torn country. Marcus hit the ground and quickly gathered his chute, scanning the area for any signs of enemy activity. His men were already in defensive positions around the perimeter, having landed exactly where they were supposed to. The mission was off to a good start. For the next 6 hours, they moved through the treacherous terrain, following goat paths and dry riverbeds to avoid detection. Their objective was a suspected Taliban supply route that intelligence believed was being used to smuggle weapons and fighters from Pakistan. Marcus's job was to confirm the route's existence and gather photographic evidence that could be used to plan future operations. The sun was high overhead when Sergeant Chen raised his fist, the signal to halt. Through his binoculars, Marcus could see what had caught Chen's attention. About half a mile ahead, a convoy of 3 vehicles was moving slowly along a mountain road. Even at this distance, he could see armed men in the truck beds. "Jackpot," whispered Corporal Williams. "That's got to be the supply route." Marcus studied the scene carefully. The convoy was exactly where intelligence had predicted it would be, but something felt wrong. The vehicles were moving too slowly, and the armed men seemed more relaxed than he would expect in a combat zone. It almost looked like they were waiting for something. He was about to signal his men to move closer when his radio crackled to life. Patterson's voice came through clearly despite the distance. "Thunder 6, this is Thunder Base. We're showing enemy movement converging on your position from multiple directions. You need to extract immediately. Proceed to extraction point Alpha." Marcus frowned. His men hadn't detected any enemy movement, and they were some of the best scouts in the division. He keyed his radio to respond, but before he could speak, the world exploded around him. Mortar rounds began falling with deadly accuracy, their explosions sending dirt and rock fragments flying through the air. The Taliban fighters he'd been observing were suddenly in full combat mode, their weapons trained on his position. It was a perfect ambush, and somehow the enemy had known exactly where to find them. "Move! Move! Move!" Marcus shouted, even as his mind raced to understand what was happening. His men responded with practiced efficiency, bounding from cover to cover as they tried to break contact with the enemy. But the mortar fire was too accurate, the enemy positions too well coordinated. Private Martinez was the first casualty. A mortar round landed less than 10 feet from his position, and Marcus watched in horror as the young soldier who had shown such courage in previous battles was thrown against a boulder by the blast. He didn't get up. "We're pinned down," Chen reported over the radio. "They've got us surrounded." Marcus could see his men taking cover behind rocks and fallen trees, returning fire when they could, but they were vastly outnumbered. The enemy seemed to know their every move before they made it. This wasn't just bad luck, this was a carefully planned trap. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Someone had betrayed them. Someone with access to their mission details had sold them out to the Taliban. The convoy he'd been observing wasn't a target, it was bait. The whole mission had been compromised from the beginning. "Thunder Base, this is Thunder 6, he radioed. "We are under heavy fire and taking casualties. Request immediate air support and medical evacuation." Patterson's voice came back immediately. "Thunder 6, air support is 20 minutes out. Can you hold your position? 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours. Marcus could see his men's ammunition running low, and the enemy was closing in from all sides. Corporal Williams was hit in the shoulder but continued fighting. Sergeant Chen's rifle jammed, and he had to switch to his sidearm. They were professionals, but they were human beings with human limitations. Then, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. One of the Taliban fighters was carrying a radio that looked suspiciously like American military equipment. As he watched, the fighter spoke into the radio, and, moments later, a new barrage of mortar fire began falling with even greater accuracy. The enemy wasn't just using intelligence about their mission, they were listening to their communications in real time. Someone had provided them with American radio frequencies and encryption codes. This wasn't just betrayal, it was treason at the highest level. "All units, switch to backup frequencies," Marcus ordered, hoping to buy his men some breathing room. But, as soon as they changed channels, the mortar fire adjusted to their new positions with the same deadly precision. Marcus made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. With his men dying around him and no hope of rescue arriving in time, he did the only thing he could think of to save their lives. He gathered the survivors, 7 out of the original 12, and led them in a desperate charge directly at the strongest enemy position. It was suicide, but it was the kind of suicide that sometimes worked in war. The Taliban fighters weren't expecting a frontal assault from a surrounded and outnumbered enemy. In the confusion that followed, Marcus and his remaining men managed to break through the enemy lines and disappear into the dense forest beyond. They ran for 3 hours, carrying their wounded and stopping only when they were certain they weren't being pursued. When they finally collapsed in exhaustion beside a mountain stream, Marcus counted his losses. 5 good men were dead, including Private Martinez, who had been like a younger brother to him. The surviving men were wounded, demoralized, and looking to him for answers he didn't have. "Sir," Sergeant Chen said quietly, "how did they know where to find us?" Marcus met his sergeant's eyes and saw the same suspicion there that was eating at his own gut. "I don't know, Chen. But I'm going to find out." When the rescue helicopters finally arrived 6 hours later, Marcus and his men were evacuated to the main base at Bagram Airfield. The official report would list the mission as a tactical failure due to unexpected enemy resistance. 5 soldiers would receive posthumous medals, and the survivors would be recommended for Purple Hearts. But Marcus knew the truth. Somewhere in the chain of command, there was a traitor whose betrayal had cost 5 good men their lives. As he sat in the medical tent, having his minor wounds treated, he made a silent promise to the friends he'd lost. He would find the person responsible, no matter how long it took or what it cost him. What he didn't know was that his investigation would uncover a conspiracy that reached much higher than he could have imagined, and that his search for justice would ultimately cost him everything he'd worked so hard to build. The man he trusted most in the world, the mentor who had guided his career and shaped his understanding of honor and duty, was about to become his greatest enemy. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson visited him in the medical tent that evening, his face grave with concern and sympathy. "I'm sorry about your men, Marcus," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Intelligence failed us. We had no idea the enemy had such a strong presence in that area." Marcus looked into his mentor's eyes and saw what appeared to be genuine grief. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that appearances could be deceiving, and that in war, the most dangerous enemies were often the ones who wore friendly faces. 3 weeks after the disastrous mission, Marcus found himself confined to base pending a full investigation into what had gone wrong. The official inquiry was being conducted by a team of military investigators from Washington, but Marcus had already begun his own private investigation. Sleep eluded him most nights as he replayed every detail of the mission, looking for clues that might reveal the identity of the traitor who had sold out his men. The base at Bagram had become a prison of sorts. While he wasn't officially under arrest, Marcus was restricted from participating in combat operations and was required to remain available for questioning at all times. He spent his days walking the perimeter, visiting the wounded survivors of his unit in the medical facility, and methodically reviewing every piece of intelligence that had been used to plan their mission. Sergeant Chen had been medically evacuated to Germany after developing complications from a piece of shrapnel that had lodged near his spine. Before he left, he had pulled Marcus aside in the hospital ward and whispered something that had been bothering him since the ambush. "Sir, I've been thinking about that radio traffic we intercepted during the firefight," Chen had said, his voice weak but determined. "Those Taliban fighters weren't just using our frequencies, they knew our call signs. They were calling each other by names that matched our operational security protocols." Marcus had felt a chill run down his spine. Operational security protocols were highly classified information that was only shared among the planning staff for each mission. The circle of people with access to that information was very small, consisting of perhaps a dozen officers and senior enlisted personnel. Now, as Marcus sat in the base library reviewing communications logs from the day of the mission, he was beginning to see a pattern that made him sick to his stomach. Every piece of intelligence that had been used to plan the mission could be traced back to a single source, Lieutenant Colonel Patterson. Patterson had provided the initial intelligence about the Taliban supply route. He had suggested the drop zone and the approach route. He had been the one to change the extraction point at the last minute, claiming that the original location had been compromised. Most damning of all, Patterson had been the only person outside of Marcus's immediate chain of command who had known the exact timing of the mission. Marcus tried to rationalize what he was discovering. Patterson was his mentor, the man who had taught him everything he knew about leadership and military tactics. The idea that such a respected officer could be a traitor seemed impossible. But the evidence was mounting, and Marcus had learned long ago that in war, impossible things happened with disturbing frequency. His investigation was interrupted by a summons to appear before the investigating committee. The hearing was held in a sterile conference room in the base headquarters, with 3 stone-faced officers from the Pentagon sitting across from him at a polished table. Marcus recognized the lead investigator as Colonel Rebecca Santos, a legendary figure in military intelligence who was known for her ability to uncover the truth no matter how deeply it was buried. "Captain Rodriguez," Colonel Santos began, her voice crisp and professional, "we've reviewed your after-action report and interviewed the surviving members of your unit. We need to discuss some discrepancies in the intelligence picture that led to your mission." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Had the investigators discovered the same inconsistencies that had been troubling him? "Yes, ma'am. I'm happy to provide any additional information that might be helpful." "Tell us about your relationship with Lieutenant Colonel Patterson," Colonel Santos continued. "How long have you known him, and how much involvement did he have in planning your mission?" The question confirmed Marcus's worst fears. The investigators were looking at Patterson as a potential security breach. Marcus chose his words carefully, knowing that his response could have far-reaching consequences for both of their careers. "Lieutenant Colonel Patterson has been my mentor since I joined the division 4 years ago," Marcus replied. "He was instrumental in planning the mission, providing most of the intelligence that we used to determine our objectives and approach routes." Colonel Santos exchanged glances with her colleagues before continuing. "Captain, we have reason to believe that someone with high-level access to operational planning may have compromised your mission. We're going to ask you some questions that may seem unusual, but I need you to answer them as completely and honestly as possible." For the next 2 hours, Marcus was grilled about every aspect of his relationship with Patterson and every detail of the mission planning process. The investigators wanted to know about Patterson's financial situation, his personal relationships, his travel patterns, and his access to classified information. They asked about unusual behavior, changes in routine, and any signs that Patterson might have been under stress or pressure. Marcus answered truthfully, but he found himself holding back the most damning evidence he had uncovered. Something deep in his gut told him that he needed to confront Patterson directly before turning him over to the investigators. He owed his mentor that much, even if the man had betrayed everything they both claimed to stand for. The hearing ended without any definitive conclusions, but Marcus could see in Colonel Santos's eyes that the investigators were closing in on something big. He was instructed to remain available for further questioning and warned not to discuss the investigation with anyone who wasn't directly involved. That evening, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson appeared at his quarters just after sunset, looking haggard and nervous. The older man's usual confidence seemed to have abandoned him, and Marcus noticed that his hands were shaking slightly as he lit a cigarette. "Marcus, we need to talk," Patterson said, glancing around nervously as if he expected to be overheard. "There are things happening here that you don't understand, and I'm afraid you're going to get caught in the middle of something that could destroy both of our careers." Marcus studied his mentor's face, looking for any sign of deception. "What kind of things, sir?" Patterson took a long drag from his cigarette before responding. "The investigation into your mission isn't what it appears to be. Colonel Santos and her team aren't just looking at a possible intelligence breach, they're investigating a much larger conspiracy that involves multiple levels of command." "What are you talking about?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew where this conversation was heading. "There's been a systematic leak of operational intelligence for the past 2 years, Patterson continued. Someone has been selling information about American military operations to Taliban commanders, and the Pentagon believes that person is embedded high in the chain of command." Marcus felt his world shifting beneath his feet. "And they think you're that person?" Patterson's silence was answer enough. Marcus watched his mentor's face crumble as the weight of the accusation settled between them. For a moment, the older man looked like what he really was, a tired, frightened human being who had made choices that he couldn't take back. "Marcus," Patterson said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to know that I never intended for your men to get hurt. The intelligence I was passing along was supposed to be low-level stuff, troop movements, supply routes, things that wouldn't result in direct combat. But they demanded more, and when I tried to back out, they threatened to expose everything." The admission hit Marcus like a physical blow. His mentor, the man he had looked up to and respected above all others, was confessing to treason. 5 good men were dead because of Patterson's betrayal, and who knew how many other soldiers had died because of intelligence he had provided to the enemy. "Who is they?" Marcus asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "A network of Taliban sympathizers and arms dealers who have been recruiting American personnel for years," Patterson replied. "They target people with financial problems, family issues, or other vulnerabilities. In my case, it was gambling debts that I couldn't pay off on a military salary." Marcus stood up slowly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Every instinct told him to grab Patterson by the throat and demand justice for his fallen comrades. But another part of him, the part that still remembered the man who had taught him to be a soldier, wanted to understand how someone could fall so far from grace. "How much?" Marcus asked. "How much were my men's lives worth to you?" Patterson's face went white. "Marcus, you have to understand how much." Marcus repeated, his voice rising. $50,000, Patterson whispered. "They paid me $50,000 for the intelligence package that included your mission details." The number was so absurdly small that Marcus felt dizzy. 5 men had died for less money than it would take to buy a decent car. The betrayal was complete and devastating, but the cheapness of it somehow made it even worse. "You son of a bitch," Marcus said, his voice barely controlled. "You sold out your own country for $50,000? Patterson tried to stand, perhaps intending to leave, but Marcus grabbed him by the front of his uniform and slammed him back into his chair. The older man was still his superior officer, but rank meant nothing in that moment. They were just 2 men, one of whom had betrayed everything the other held sacred. "Please, Marcus," Patterson pleaded. "You don't understand the pressure I was under. My wife was sick, my son needed surgery, and the medical bills were crushing us. I thought I could pass along some harmless information and get out of debt, but it spiraled out of control." Marcus released his grip on Patterson's uniform but remained standing over him, his mind racing through the implications of what he had just learned. The investigation was closing in, and Patterson was clearly desperate. That desperation made him dangerous, especially to someone who now knew the truth about his crimes. "What do you want from me?" Marcus asked. "I want you to help me disappear," Patterson replied. "I have contacts who can get me out of the country before the investigators can build a case against me. All I need is 24 hours to get to Pakistan, and then I'll be beyond their reach." The audacity of the request stunned Marcus into momentary silence. Patterson wasn't just confessing his crimes, he was asking for help in escaping justice. The man who had trained him to uphold the values of honor, duty, and country was now asking him to become an accessory to treason. "You're out of your mind," Marcus said finally. "I'm not going to help you escape. You're going to face the consequences of what you've done." Patterson's expression hardened, and Marcus caught a glimpse of the calculating intelligence that had made him such an effective officer. "I'm afraid you don't have a choice, Marcus. You see, the investigators are already suspicious of everyone who was involved in planning your mission. If they discover that you knew about my activities and failed to report them, you'll be charged as an accessory." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Patterson was willing to destroy Marcus's career and possibly his freedom to save himself. The mentor who had shaped his understanding of leadership was now using that knowledge to manipulate and threaten him. Marcus felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. The last of his respect for Patterson evaporated, replaced by a determination to ensure that justice was served, no matter the personal cost. He had lost 5 men under his command, and he would not allow their sacrifice to be meaningless. "Get out," Marcus said quietly. Patterson stood slowly, studying Marcus's face for any sign of weakness or uncertainty. Finding none, he nodded and moved toward the door. But, before leaving, he turned back with one final threat. "You have until tomorrow morning to change your mind, Marcus. After that, I'll have no choice but to tell the investigators that you were involved in the intelligence leaks from the beginning. Your career will be over, and you'll spend the next 20 years in a military prison." The door closed behind Patterson, leaving Marcus alone with the weight of an impossible decision. He could help his former mentor escape and preserve his own career, or he could do the right thing and risk losing everything he had worked for. As he sat in his empty quarters, staring at the photographs of his fallen men that he kept on his desk, Marcus realized that the choice wasn't really a choice at all. Justice demanded sacrifice, and he was prepared to pay whatever price was necessary to ensure that Patterson faced the consequences of his betrayal. Tomorrow, he would go to Colonel Santos and tell her everything he knew. Patterson would be arrested, tried, and hopefully executed for treason. And Marcus would probably be court-martialed as an accessory, even though he had done nothing wrong. But his men would be avenged, and that was worth any personal cost. In a war where the lines between right and wrong had become increasingly blurred, Marcus had found his moral compass again. He would not compromise his principles, even if it meant the end of his military career and his freedom. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He sat at his small desk, staring out the window at the Afghan mountains silhouetted against the star-filled sky, and wrote letters to the families of the 5 men who had died under his command. He told them about their sons' and husbands' courage, their dedication to their fellow soldiers, and their sacrifice for their country. What he didn't tell them was that their loved ones had died because of betrayal, because someone they trusted had sold their lives for money. At 0500 hours, Marcus made his decision. He walked across the base to Colonel Santos's temporary office in the headquarters building. The early morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of dust and diesel fuel that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat over the past 2 years. This might be his last morning as a free man, but he felt more at peace than he had since the disastrous mission 3 weeks ago. Colonel Santos was already at work, surrounded by stacks of files and evidence bags. She looked up as Marcus knocked on her open door, and he could see in her eyes that she had been expecting this visit. "Captain Rodriguez," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "You're up early this morning." "Yes, ma'am. I have information about the intelligence leak that led to the compromise of my mission." Colonel Santos leaned back in her chair, studying Marcus's face carefully. "I'm listening." For the next hour, Marcus told her everything. He described his investigation into the mission intelligence, his discovery of Patterson's involvement, and the confession that Patterson had made the previous evening. He provided documentation that he had gathered, including communication logs and intelligence reports that showed the pattern of information flow that had led to the ambush. Colonel Santos listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes but mostly just absorbing the details of Marcus's account. When he finished, she sat in silence for several minutes, processing what she had heard. "Captain," she said finally, "do you understand the implications of what you're telling me? You're accusing a senior officer of treason and admitting that you withheld this information from investigators for several days." "Yes, ma'am. I understand that I'll probably be charged as an accessory, but I couldn't live with myself if I let Patterson escape justice for what he did to my men." Colonel Santos stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the base coming to life as the morning shift began. "Captain Rodriguez, there's something you need to know. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson didn't disappear last night as he threatened to do." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Ma'am?" "He was found dead in his quarters at 0200 hours this morning. A single gunshot wound to the head. The weapon was his service pistol, and there was a suicide note taking full responsibility for the intelligence leaks that led to the deaths of your men." The news hit Marcus like a physical blow. Whatever else Patterson had been, he had once been a good soldier and a decent man. The weight of his crimes and the certainty of exposure had apparently been too much to bear. "Sir," Marcus said quietly, "I need to know, was it really suicide?" Colonel Santos turned back to him with a slight smile. "That's an interesting question, Captain. What makes you think it might not have been?" Marcus considered his words carefully. "Patterson told me last night that he was part of a larger network. People who were willing to kill American soldiers for money probably wouldn't hesitate to kill American officers who might expose them. You're right to be suspicious, Colonel Santos replied. The circumstances of Patterson's death are indeed questionable, and we're treating it as a potential homicide. But that's not why I'm here, and it's not why this investigation has become so important. She returned to her desk and opened a thick file that Marcus hadn't noticed before. Captain, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. The intelligence leak that compromised your mission wasn't an isolated incident. We believe it's part of a systematic effort by enemy agents to penetrate American military operations throughout this theater of operations. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. How systematic? At least 15 missions over the past 2 years have been compromised by intelligence leaks. Your mission was just the most recent, and the most deadly. We estimate that more than 50 American soldiers have died as a result of information that was sold to the Taliban. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Marcus had thought he was dealing with one corrupt officer, but Colonel Santos was describing what amounted to a conspiracy that had cost dozens of lives. Ma'am, what do you need from me? Colonel Santos closed the file and looked directly into Marcus's eyes. We need you to go undercover and help us identify the other members of this network. Patterson was a small fish in a much larger pond, and his death may have been intended to prevent him from exposing his handlers. The proposal was so unexpected that Marcus initially thought he had misheard. Ma'am, I'm not qualified for undercover work. I'm an infantry officer, not an intelligence operative. You're exactly what we need, Colonel Santos replied. You have a legitimate reason to be angry about intelligence failures. You've lost men under your command, and you have every right to be questioning the competence and loyalty of your superiors. That anger and suspicion will be your cover. She opened another file and showed him photographs of 3 officers stationed at various bases throughout Afghanistan. These men are all suspected of involvement in the intelligence network. We need someone to get close to them, gain their trust, and find out how the network operates. Marcus studied the photographs. One was a major he recognized from joint operations meetings. Another was a colonel stationed at Kabul who had a reputation for living well above his apparent means. The third was a captain about his own age who worked in communications and had access to virtually every classified message that passed through the theater. What makes you think they'll trust me? Because you're going to approach them as a potential recruit, Colonel Santos explained. You're going to let them know that you're bitter about how the investigation has been handled, that you're tired of losing men because of poor intelligence, and that you might be interested in finding alternative sources of income. The plan was dangerous and morally complex. Marcus would essentially be pretending to be a traitor in order to catch real traitors. If he was discovered, he would be killed by the enemy agents he was trying to expose. If he was too convincing in his performance, he might be charged with treason by his own side. Ma'am, why should I trust you? How do I know that you're not part of this network yourself? Colonel Santos smiled for the first time since Marcus had met her. That's exactly the kind of paranoid thinking that will keep you alive in this operation. The truth is, you don't know if you can trust me, just as I don't know if I can trust you. But we both know that good soldiers are dying because of betrayal, and we're both committed to stopping it. She handed him a new set of orders that had been prepared in advance. According to the documents, Captain Marcus Rodriguez was being transferred to a special liaison position that would require him to work closely with intelligence officers from multiple commands. It was the perfect cover for the kind of access he would need to investigate the suspected traitors. You'll have a handler who will provide you with communication protocols and emergency procedures, Colonel Santos continued. But, for the most part, you'll be operating independently. The success of this mission will depend on your ability to think on your feet and adapt to changing circumstances. Marcus looked at the orders and felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. 5 men had already died because of his failure to protect them from betrayal. Now he was being asked to prevent future betrayals that could cost many more lives. It was a chance for redemption, but it was also a path that could lead to his own destruction. I'll do it, he said finally. I thought you would, Colonel Santos replied. But, before you commit completely, there's one more thing you need to know. If this operation goes wrong, if you're discovered or compromised, the army will disavow any knowledge of your activities. You'll be on your own, facing charges of treason with no support from the chain of command. Marcus nodded. He had expected as much. Undercover operations always carried the risk of abandonment if they went bad. But, he had already lost everything that mattered to him: his men, his trust in his superiors, his faith in the system he had devoted his life to serving. He had nothing left to lose except his life, and that seemed like a fair price to pay for the chance to honor the memory of the soldiers who had died under his command. Over the next 6 months, Marcus threw himself into his new role with the intensity of a man who had found his purpose. He cultivated relationships with the suspected traitors, gradually earning their trust by expressing his bitterness about the military hierarchy and his financial difficulties. He attended their social gatherings, shared their complaints about poor leadership and inadequate pay, and slowly allowed them to believe that he might be receptive to offers of additional income. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Marcus had to maintain his cover while gathering evidence, never knowing if his targets suspected his true purpose or if they were planning to eliminate him as a threat. He learned to live with constant paranoia, checking his food for poison, varying his routines to avoid ambush, and sleeping with a loaded pistol within reach. But, gradually, his patience and skill began to pay off. The suspected traitors revealed themselves to be part of an even larger network than Colonel Santos had imagined. There were more than a dozen American military personnel involved in selling intelligence to the Taliban, along with civilian contractors and foreign nationals who served as intermediaries and financiers. Marcus documented everything. He recorded conversations, photographed documents, and identified the communication methods that the network used to coordinate their activities. He discovered that the network was being run by a Taliban intelligence officer who had been educated in the United States and spoke perfect English, making him highly effective at recruiting American assets. The breakthrough came when Marcus was finally invited to meet with the network's leadership. The meeting was held in a safe house in Kabul, with security provided by corrupt Afghan police officers who were being paid to look the other way. Marcus wore a wire and carried a backup recording device, knowing that this might be his only chance to gather the evidence needed to bring down the entire network. The Taliban intelligence officer, who called himself simply the Professor, was not what Marcus had expected. He was a soft-spoken man in his 40s who looked more like an academic than a terrorist. But his eyes held the cold intelligence of someone who understood exactly how much damage he had inflicted on American forces. "Captain Rodriguez," the professor said in accent-free English, "I understand that you've become disillusioned with your government's approach to this conflict." Marcus nodded, playing his role perfectly. "I've lost too many good men because of poor intelligence and political interference. If there's a way to make some money while ensuring that future operations are better informed, I'm interested." The professor smiled. "Excellent. We have need of someone with your access and experience. The compensation would be substantial enough to set you up comfortably for the rest of your life." What followed was a detailed discussion of the network's operations, including the methods used to recruit American personnel, the types of intelligence that were most valuable, and the payment structures that ensured loyalty. Marcus recorded every word, knowing that he was gathering evidence that would send dozens of people to prison or to their deaths. But, as the meeting progressed, Marcus began to realize that something was wrong. The professor was being too open, too willing to share sensitive information with someone he had just met. Either the man was incredibly naive, or he suspected that Marcus was not what he appeared to be. The answer came when Marcus tried to leave the safe house. The doors were locked, and armed guards were posted outside. The professor's friendly smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of cold fury. "Did you really think we wouldn't investigate a new recruit thoroughly?" the professor asked. "We know all about your investigation into Lieutenant Colonel Patterson. We know about your meetings with Colonel Santos. We know that you're working undercover to expose our network." Marcus felt his heart racing as he realized that his cover had been blown. The wire he was wearing would be discovered within minutes, and then he would be tortured for information about the investigation before being killed. He had to act fast if he wanted to survive. The room contained 4 people besides Marcus the professor, 2 American officers who were part of the network, and an Afghan interpreter who was obviously armed. Marcus calculated his chances and didn't like what he saw, but he had been in worse situations and survived. He pretended to be defeated, slumping his shoulders and adopting the posture of a man who had given up hope. "How did you know?" "Patterson told us before he died," the professor replied. "Oh yes, we killed him to prevent him from talking to your investigators. But not before we learned about your little charade." The revelation that Patterson had been murdered rather than having committed suicide filled Marcus with rage. His mentor might have been a traitor, but he had still deserved better than execution by foreign agents operating on American soil. Marcus used that rage to fuel his next actions. He exploded into motion, grabbing a heavy glass ashtray from the table and hurling it at the professor's head. The Afghan interpreter went for his weapon, but Marcus was already moving, tackling the man and wrestling for control of his pistol. The 2 American officers were slower to react, apparently not expecting their prisoner to fight back with such ferocity. Marcus managed to get the interpreter's pistol and put 2 rounds into the nearest traitor before diving behind a couch as the room erupted in gunfire. What followed was a running battle through the safe house as Marcus fought his way toward the exit. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but he had the advantages of surprise and desperation. The wire he was wearing was transmitting everything to Colonel Santos's team, who would hopefully be en route with backup. Marcus made it to the ground floor of the building before a bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a wall. He could hear his pursuers closing in, and he knew that his only chance was to reach the street where witnesses might prevent his execution. He stumbled through the front door of the safe house just as Colonel Santos and her team arrived in force. The corrupt Afghan police officers who had been guarding the building scattered like roaches when the light comes on, abandoning their posts rather than face American Special Operations soldiers. The professor and the surviving members of the network were captured alive, along with extensive documentation of their operations. Within weeks, the entire intelligence network had been rolled up, with arrests made at bases throughout Afghanistan and back in the United States. Marcus spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from his wound, but his real healing took much longer. The investigation revealed that the network had been responsible for the deaths of 63 American soldiers over a period of 3 years. Patterson's betrayal had been just one piece of a much larger puzzle of corruption and treachery. At the official hearing that followed, Marcus was cleared of any wrongdoing and recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross for his undercover work. The families of the men who had died in the ambush were finally told the truth about what had happened to their loved ones, and many of them found some comfort in knowing that justice had been served. Marcus returned to the United States 6 months later, promoted to major and offered a position with military intelligence. But the war had changed him in fundamental ways. He had seen too much betrayal, lost too many friends, and carried too many burdens to continue with military life as if nothing had happened. Instead, he retired from the army and used his experience to establish a private security firm that specialized in protecting American personnel overseas. His company's motto was simple: honor above all. It was a principle that he had learned the hard way in the mountains of Afghanistan, when the sky had been full of enemies and the ground had been the only place where truth could be found. The nightmares still came sometimes, usually featuring the faces of the men he had lost and the sound of mortar rounds falling like deadly rain. But Marcus had learned to live with those dreams, knowing that they were the price of survival and the burden of command. He had been betrayed in the sky, but he had found his victory on the ground, in the form of justice served and honor preserved against all odds.